Imagine you woke up tomorrow, and every single word had disappeared. Not your memories, not your emotions, not the people you love, just the words. You walk outside, the sky stretches endlessly above you. Birds sing, the wind brushes against your skin. You can see everything. You can hear everything. You can feel everything. But you can't name any of it. Could you still think? There's a strange moment in every person's life that none of us remember. The first time someone pointed at the sky and said, "That's blue." Before that moment, the sky wasn't blue. Not because the color didn't exist, it did, but because you had never separated that color from everything else. It was simply part of the world. The same thing happened with trees, with rain, with your mother's face. Someone pointed, someone spoke, and suddenly the universe became divided into pieces. This is a tree. That is water. That bright thing above you is the sun. It feels so natural that we never question it. But think about it. The world came first. The words came later. Which means every word you've ever learned isn't reality. It's a decision, a label, a tiny agreement between billions of people. Yet somehow, those tiny agreements became the way we think. Take the word yellow. What exactly is yellow? Is it a color? A feeling? A memory of afternoon sunlight? The warmth of old photographs? The petals of a flower? The word doesn't contain any of those things. It only points toward them. The word water isn't wet. The word fire doesn't burn. The word love has never hugged anyone. Words aren't the thing. They're symbols. Tiny arrows pointing toward experiences. And yet, without those symbols, how much of the world could we even understand? This sounds like a small question. It isn't. Because if words shape the way we describe reality, what if they also shape the reality we experience? That question terrified one man more than almost anyone else. His name was George Orwell. When was the last time you noticed your own language? Probably never. And that's exactly the point. Language is like a pair of glasses you've worn since the day you were born. At first they felt unfamiliar. Then they became comfortable. Eventually you forgot you were wearing them at all. You don't wake up and consciously decide to think in English or French. Thought arrives already dressed in the language you've spent your life inhabiting. But here's something strange. If words are only labels, then changing the labels shouldn't change the world, right? Imagine I point to a tree and call it a lamp. The tree doesn't become a lamp. Reality doesn't change. So maybe words really are just names. That seems obvious until you notice something far more subtle. Think about your emotions. Have you ever felt something you couldn't explain? Not sadness, not happiness, not anger. Something in between. You knew it was there, but every word you tried felt wrong. It was like trying to describe a color no one else had seen. Then one day you read a book, heard a friend speak, or came across a word online, and suddenly everything clicked. There it is. That's exactly what I've been feeling. The emotion didn't appear the moment you learned the word. It had been living inside you all along. But once it had a name, it became easier to notice, easier to understand, easier to remember. Language hadn't created the feeling. It had illuminated it. We see this happen all the time. A few years ago, most people had never heard the word ghosting. The experience existed long before the word. People disappeared from relationships centuries before smartphones were invented. But once the word became common, millions of people suddenly recognized a shared experience. Another example is doom scrolling. Endless scrolling through bad news wasn't born the day the word appeared. But once it had a name, people began catching themselves doing it. The experience hadn't changed, our awareness had. A single word had sharpened our attention. And that's the strange power of language. Words don't always create reality. Sometimes they decide which parts of reality we can easily see. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine an experience that has no word. You can feel it, you know it's there. But every attempt to explain it falls apart. How do you share it with someone else? How do you even hold on to it yourself? Maybe you've experienced this while watching a sunset, or standing in a place so beautiful that for a moment, language feels almost offensive. People say, "It's beautiful." But beautiful doesn't feel big enough. The word reaches the experience and falls short. Some things refuse to fit inside language, and that raises an uncomfortable possibility. If language helps us notice certain parts of reality, what happens when someone begins taking words away? Not replacing them, not redefining them, erasing them entirely. That question became the foundation of one of the most unsettling novels ever written. Not because it imagined a government controlling what people could say, but because it imagined a government controlling what people could think. George Orwell called that language newspeak. George Orwell wasn't trying to predict the future. He was trying to warn us about it. When most people think of 1984, they remember the cameras, Big Brother, the constant surveillance. But Orwell believed there was something even more dangerous than being watched: having your language rewritten. In his world, the government didn't simply ban books. They didn't just arrest people for disagreeing. They did something far more patient. They began removing words, not all at once, one by one. Every year, the dictionary became smaller. Fewer words, fewer expressions, fewer ways to describe the world. One of the characters in 1984 proudly explains this process. Why have 100 words when one will do? Why say excellent, wonderful, magnificent, or brilliant, when you could simply say good, and if something wasn't good, it became ungood. No need for terrible, or awful, or horrific, just ungood. At first, this sounds efficient, even practical. Why carry around 10 words when one can do the job? But Orwell wasn't worried about efficiency. He was worried about nuance. Imagine someone asks you how your day was. You answer, "Good." But what does that mean? Were you relieved? Peaceful? Excited? Content? Grateful? Proud? Hopeful? Those aren't the same feeling. They're neighbors, not twins. Language lets us separate them. Without those words, they begin to blur together. And when everything becomes blurred, thinking becomes lazy. Imagine walking into an art gallery. Every painting has been replaced with a single shade of gray you can still see. But you've lost contrast. You've lost detail. You've lost the ability to notice what made each painting unique. That's what Orwell feared. Not blindness, a slow fading of color. The same thing happens with ideas. Suppose your language has no word for freedom. You can still resist injustice. You can still feel that something is wrong. But how do you explain it? How do you gather thousands of people around an idea that has no name? How do you teach your children to protect something they cannot easily describe? Words don't imprison reality, but they give us places to gather around it. They become meeting points for human experience. This is why dictators throughout history have often cared so much about language. Not because changing a word instantly changes a person's mind. It doesn't. Reality has a stubborn way of surviving. People can still feel hunger, even if they're forbidden from saying they're starving. People can still recognize cruelty, even when it is called justice. But if enough words disappear, if enough conversations become impossible, if enough ideas lose their names, the truth becomes harder to share. harder to remember, harder to pass from one generation to the next. Language doesn't build the prison by itself, but it can decide how many doors are left open. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: you don't need a dictator for language to shrink. Sometimes we do it to ourselves. We replace long conversations with short captions, complex arguments with slogans, nuance with certainty. A person becomes good or evil. An opinion becomes right or wrong. A stranger becomes an enemy. The vocabulary grows smaller, and with it, our patience for complexity. Maybe Orwell's greatest warning wasn't about a government editing a dictionary. Maybe it was about ordinary people slowly losing the habit of careful speech. Because every time a language loses a shade of meaning, the world becomes just a little less colorful. Which brings us back to a question that has been waiting quietly since the beginning. If words can shape what we notice, and losing words can narrow what we easily express, what happens to everything that has never had a word at all? Because some of the deepest parts of being human have always existed beyond language. For a moment, forget George Orwell. Forget governments. Forget dictionaries. Let's go back to something much smaller. A conversation. Have you ever tried to explain how you felt and failed? Not because you didn't understand yourself, but because every sentence sounded wrong. You said, "I'm fine," but you weren't. You said, "I'm sad." But sadness wasn't quite it. You weren't angry. You weren't lonely. You weren't afraid. Whatever you were feeling didn't have a name. We've all lived through moments like that. The strange thing is, the feeling doesn't become real when we find a word for it. It was already there. The word simply gives us something to reach for. Language is full of these moments. There are words in one language that seem impossible to carry into another. Not because translators aren't skilled enough, but because every language chooses to pay attention to different parts of reality. In French, German, Spanish, and many others, objects have grammatical gender. A bridge, a moon, a key, a table. None of these things are biologically male or female. Yet speakers encounter them through patterns their language has carried for generations. Does that mean German speakers literally see a masculine bridge? No. Reality doesn't change because grammar changes. But language does something quieter. It encourages certain habits of attention. It highlights some distinctions. It leaves others in the background. Every language shines its flashlight in a slightly different direction. And every flashlight leaves part of the room in darkness. Maybe that's why translation is so difficult. You can translate the dictionary, but can you translate the feeling? Can you translate childhood? Can you translate the silence after an apology? Can you translate the exact way your grandmother said your name? Some experiences survive translation. Others lose something invisible along the way. Which brings me to perhaps the biggest word any human being has ever spoken. God. One word. But what does it actually contain? When someone says God, are they describing the whole of God's essence? Or are they doing what we've always done with language, pointing towards something too large to hold? Imagine trying to pour the ocean into a glass. No matter how carefully you try, the glass was never meant to contain the sea. Perhaps words work the same way. The word God isn't God. The word love isn't love. The word grief has never cried. The word fire has never burned. Words are containers. Useful containers. Beautiful containers. Necessary containers. But containers nonetheless. They can carry meaning. They cannot become the meaning itself. Maybe that's why the greatest moments in life often leave us speechless. The birth of a child, standing beneath a sky filled with stars, losing someone you love, falling in love for the first time. There is usually a moment, before we begin speaking, where language simply gives up. And perhaps that's not language's failure. Perhaps that's its reminder. Reality has always been bigger than the words we use to describe it. Which leaves us with one final question. If words are only maps, how much of the world have we mistaken for the territory itself?